edge. I want to talk now about the struggle, the intellectual struggle that he went through in his intellectual and philosophical projects. Nietzsche wanted to analyze the whole foundation of European ethics and philosophy. But he also wanted to use a writing style that would differ from other philosophical works. He didn't want to write in a systematic philosophical form or discourse. Instead, he wanted to use humor. He wanted to use aphorisms to make his points. He would write in short paragraphs, divided one after another, rather than a long flowing argument. And he once claimed that he would like to rank philosophers not on the basis of their logical arguments, but on the basis of their laughter. Or as he said, he would rank them all the way up to those capable of golden laughter. He admired the role of humor, and he saw laughter as part of the human condition, that people needed to know how to laugh. And I think this is an interesting idea if you think of ranking philosophers not according to the rigor of their rational arguments, but according to the way in which they either laugh or can elicit laughter. And that was what Nietzsche tried to do, was to write with a kind of edge that brought humor into his philosophy, or a kind of irony into his philosophy, as well as a metaphysical critique. Well, Nietzsche argued that modern European culture was filled with the masses, dominated by the masses, who followed what he called a herd culture, in which they were more concerned with material comforts and with social conformity than with any kind of intellectual creativity. And he said that this culture suppressed all challenges to mediocrity. If someone rose up to challenge the mediocrity, they would be ridiculed, they would be pushed down, they would be ignored. And of course he thought this was one reason why he was ignored. His books didn't sell while he was still living. But in contrast to this culture of mediocrity, this culture of the herd, as he put it, Nietzsche described the cultural ideal of a few heroic, life-affirming individuals who could create their own values, who could create their own sense of truth and live by that, rather than by the conformity with the herd. Now, Nietzsche said that the ancient Greek ideal was the ideal that modern people should try to recover in some way. They couldn't simply be ancient Greeks, but they should be aware of the ancient Greek ideals. The ancient Greek ideal of independent, strong-willed persons. This is how he sort of romanticized ancient Greeks. But he said that this Greek ideal of the independent person had been destroyed by bourgeois materialism and by the post-revolutionary democratic culture of the 19th century. He saw the French Revolution as creating this emphasis on democratic equality, whereas for Nietzsche, the true way of understanding human beings is to understand that there are elites, there are people who push beyond the crowd, beyond the general population. And he argued that more generally, this democratic celebration of the common person, which was the new idea of 19th century democratic culture, this democratic celebration of the common person was a secular version of Christian concepts of charity and humility. Nietzsche argued that Christian values had impoverished life, that Christian values dehumanized individuals by denying their healthy will to power, their healthy instincts. And here again, you can hear a little echo of a certain kind of Darwinian thought, which argues that out of the person there are drives, there are deep instincts that have to be expressed. But for Nietzsche, these drives have been repressed by Christian culture. And so Nietzsche sought to understand this cultural process of repression by analyzing the two major sources of the Western tradition, Greek thought and Judeo-Christian thought. And he argued in his first book, The Birth of Tragedy, which was published in 1872, that early Greek culture had been heroic in affirming the human condition and the deep instinctual drives of human beings. That the Greeks had understood that deep life force that comes out of human beings, and they had accepted that part of life which is passionate which Nietzsche himself called the Dionysian part of life, named for the ancient Greek god Dionysus, the god of the festival, of the carnival, of the celebration. And for Nietzsche, this Dionysian philosophy was the genius of pre-Socratic thought. It did not depend on reason, it expressed the instincts, the drives. But as Nietzsche described it, as Socrates and then Plato developed their ideas, the instinctual side of life was repressed, and the Dionysian drives gave way to the calculating, Apollonian approach to life, Apollo, the god of reason and thought. And so European culture, which followed the Greeks, had turned to abstraction, to metaphysics, to an abstract rationality, and in making that move, Europeans had fled from the conditions of a healthy, instinctual life. They had turned their back on the healthy drives. So this was part of the mistake of the Greek philosophical tradition. And Nietzsche went on to explain this flight from human life or human drives in his later works, most notably in the book Beyond Good and Evil, published in 1886, and The Genealogy of Morals, published in 1887. And in these books, he turned to that other component of the Western tradition, Christianity. And he claimed that the rejection of a healthy, instinctual life had culminated in Christianity, which fused Judaism with Plato and Platonic metaphysics. So you have the two great strands of the Western tradition, Greek philosophy, Platonic philosophy, and Judeo-Christian ethics coming together in what he called the Western tradition, or the Western philosophical or theological tradition. And this system, the Judeo-Christian ethical system, as Nietzsche described it, was an ethical system that favored the weak over the strong or the healthy. And according to Nietzsche, Christian philosophy's view of human instincts was anti-human or escapist. It denied what was most important about human beings. It repressed the drives. And again, the Darwinian echo that you can hear in this kind of argument. Now, actually, Nietzsche assumed that Christianity, on some level, did express a deep, healthy instinct, a kind of will to power. But he said in Christianity, the will to power was an instinct that had been distorted, because Christianity became the triumph of weak people's will to power over the strong and the noble. So Western culture had turned to God over human beings. They had turned their backs, Western thinkers had turned their backs on the body, on the human aspects of life, and embraced the transcendent, this idea of God. But in the modern world, according to Nietzsche, modern science had destroyed the classical explanations for God. The explanations that said we can see God in nature, or we can see that the world was created by God, or we can see God's will working itself out in history and in human life. And Nietzsche said, no, modern people no longer really believe that. And so because of their science and their new forms of knowledge, they no longer really believe in God. And this is why Nietzsche said God was dead. He said that, in fact, the belief in God was no longer truly part of cultural life in modern Europe. And yet most people refused to accept this idea. They denied that God was dead, either with their formal religion or with their moral cliches. But in their daily lives, they never really acted as if they believed this. They simply repeated these pious phrases, but God was really dead for these people. So modern Europe, according to Nietzsche, had entered into an age of nihilism because it no longer really believed in its older foundations for truth or morality. It didn't really believe in what it said it did. European culture was in some sense living a lie. And for Nietzsche, this was the basis of the crisis in Europe. But very few people would face this crisis directly. Instead of admitting that God was dead, the masses turned to other religions, which were very dangerous in Nietzsche's view. And these other religions, of course, were not really religions. They were things like nationalism, or mass democracy, or socialism, or liberalism, or anti-Semitism. All these isms which Nietzsche didn't like. But he said these are the ways in which people flee from the fact that they really don't believe in anything. But these ideologies of the mass culture prevented people from seeing their true situation, from seeing how sick the society had become. But Nietzsche said that in order to achieve cultural or personal health in the face of this illness, people must accept that the old truths were dying. You couldn't continue to pretend that the old traditions still worked. People had to admit that the world lacks an inherent meaning, that the world lacks God, that there is no higher meaning. And yet, when you admit that, you can see that there are still strong human beings who can heroically affirm their lives. And these few heroic people must now create a new morality. They must move beyond the categories of good and evil. They must go beyond religious truths as we have understood them. These heroic persons must define new truths for themselves. And he said that these truths are constructed out of the drives and passions of individual persons. And this search for truth is connected to the will to power. It is not transcendent. It is not universal. It comes out of the will to power. But very few people can actually face this reality. Very few people can take the heroic steps to create their own morality or their own truths. Only the elite, strong thinkers, whom Nietzsche called the overmen, or the happy few, can actually create their own morality. And these are the people who will ignore the values of the herd, as he put it. So for Nietzsche, the overman creates his own values. The overman lives heroically and ignores the ideas of the masses or the ideas of the democratic herd. This person is lonely, but this person lives honestly and strongly in a kind of heroic affirmation of pre-Socratic Greek values. But the key point for all of these heroic persons is that they must move beyond the cliches and the assumptions of modern European culture. The cliches that blinded people to the reality of their world, and the cliches that had descended from the French Revolution. And Nietzsche wanted to move beyond the reason and the egalitarian political claims of the Enlightenment. He saw the Enlightenment and the French Revolution as a kind of secularized Christianity. And Nietzsche wanted his new thinkers to affirm life against what he saw as the culture's repression of instincts. And so in Nietzsche, we can see the themes that will emerge in 20th century psychology in thinkers like Freud. Or we can see the themes of later critiques of reason and classical philosophy. That's why we can see Nietzsche as a starting point for the 20th century. But at the same time, we can see in Nietzsche the end of a cycle in intellectual history, a cycle that began in the optimism and aspirations of the Enlightenment and the French Revolution. And Nietzsche argued that this tradition was deeply flawed. But the debate about that tradition would continue. The debate about the Enlightenment would continue because many others saw this tradition as Europe's most valuable political and cultural inheritance, and as a starting point for a better future. And so the debates of 19th century intellectual life carried over into the 20th century because the main political, social, and cultural arguments were never really resolved at the end of the 19th century. And in fact, most of the influential ideas and intellectual debates that emerged in the 19th century are still part of our life today, the beginning of the 21st century. And so, as I've tried to suggest in this course, we have to continue an intellectual dialogue with the critical thinkers and writers of the 19th century, because this dialogue is also a dialogue with parts of ourselves in the world in which we still live.
We hope you've enjoyed these lectures from our Great Courses series. Our courses are now available to order online.